There's all of that very overt indoctrination, but I think what's more damaging is the very subtle indoctrination. They'll slip in gender ideology.
Woke ideology about race and gender has spread through much of American society, even the children's book industry, says conservative commentator and writer Bethany Mandel.
It's a pretty toxic way to raise a child, to either peg them as a victim or victimizer.
Mandel is the editor of Heroes of Liberty Publishing. Their children's books have made headlines after their Facebook ad account was locked and subsequently reinstated. Today we discuss what she sees happening in the industry and growing red flags in K-12 education.
Do you want to live in a country where everyone hates the country?
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Bethany Mandel, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know, I just read the most amazing book. It's a kid's book, but I learned a ton from it myself. Thomas Sowell, A Self-Made Man.
Yeah, that sounds very familiar.
Well, so you're the editor of this new series of books. It's encountered a bit of controversy lately.
Yeah.
But we'll talk a little bit about that, but mostly I want to learn about these books.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating, beautiful illustrations, beautiful stories, and frankly, as I said, I learned a lot through it.
Yeah, I did too, honestly. So we have a series of 3 books out with Heroes of Liberty. The first one is about Thomas Sowell, Ronald Reagan is the second, and Amy Coney Barrett is the third. And we sort of started this project because we saw a hole in the market, and the hole was like wholesome, patriotic, pro-American, really educational books for children that were captivating. And part of that captivation for kids is the illustrations. The illustrations are really just beautiful and stunning, and were a really high priority for us. I'm a mother of 5, and I'm a connoisseur of children's books as a result. And you know, kids need to be hooked into books with great illustrations, and so that was what we did.
Well, okay, so let's start with, you know, the whole conceptualization of these books. Like, why is this particular sort of picture book, and I understand it's from about 8 to 12s, needed at this point?
So the children's book industry as it stands now is extremely woke. The from the top to the bottom of the pyramid of, you know, how it's kind of like the Schoolhouse Rock, like how a bill becomes a law, how an idea becomes a book. It's woke from top to bottom. So the authors who are able to get contracts sort of ideologically fit this box that is woke, or they can't be authors. And so they pitch books to agents who know what the editors want, and then the editors sort of have to go through the cycle of making sure that these fit the parameters of the dialogue that they need and the agenda that they need in the children's book industry. And so then you sort of follow the book through the editorial process into the publishing houses. And the next step for a book become a sort of a well-selling book is it needs reviews. And so they get lots of good reviews, and the more woke the book, the better the reviews. For well-reviewed books, then they land at the top of the award lists. And then once you get lots of awards from, again, woke award givers, then they sort of land at the top of the recommendations for schools and librarians to purchase in bulk. If you were to put any blame on any part of the industry of sort of what's driving this, it's the educators, it's the librarians and the teachers. And so they have mass purchasing power, and so they buy, you know, the most woke books in bulk, and then the cycle, you know, keeps on perpetuating. So we saw a hole in the market because, you know, for the everyday parent, for content that you don't have to pre-screen, that you know sort of imparts your values, or at the very least, you don't have to pre-read. For me as a parent, I'm happy with a book that I don't have to filter in any way and that I can just read to my kids. But we saw that there wasn't just a market for that, but there was a market for books that were patriotic, that taught children about our country and about these great figures. And the nice thing about the books, sort of using a biography is a really special way for kids to learn, and for me, honestly, personally also, to form a connection with a human being and a person, and then learn about who they were and their morals and everything, but also helps them learn about that time period as well, because they're forming a personal connection with that time period. So, for example, with Thomas Sowell would probably be the best example of the first three. You sort of learn about Jim Crow and civil rights, and you sort of follow him through his life of what it was like to be a Black American from, when he was born until the present day.
Well, and it's very interesting because it obviously covers a lot of ground. Thomas Sowell, thank goodness, is still with us and still writing. It's not a preachy book. It's not trying to tell you how you need to be. It's a story of someone who chose to make their life a particular way.
Yeah, and that's something that I believe in deeply. As a connoisseur of children's literature, I homeschool my 5 children, and we have a literature-based sort of philosophy that we follow in our homeschool, long predating my involvement with Heroes of Liberty, and so I sort of incorporated that belief and that understanding into what we were doing. People think that children are stupid, and they're not. They understand when they're being condescended to, they understand when they're being spoon-fed, and they can handle big ideas, and they can handle serious topics. And so we wanted to treat our readers, parents and children alike, as intelligent human beings, and give them the whole meal. And the nice thing about children's literature, so our age range is between like 7 and 12, I would say, but my 4-year-old takes something from it. He might not eat everything on the plate, but he takes some of the green beans from the Thomas Sowell plate.
There's this culture today, and I think it relates to wokeness and so forth, that you kind of like, in some ways, shelter children from a certain range of things and expose them dramatically to another range of things. But it's the sheltering part. I mean, this book, the Thomas Sowell book, doesn't hide the realities of Jim Crow and the difficulties and this kind of whole realm. And I found that interesting and different from the limited number, having nephews, of children's books that I've seen recently. Yeah,
and so that's another thing that I believe very strongly about, and sort of treating children as human beings. Homeschool philosophy we follow is Charlotte Mason, and so I kind of slip into that dialogue a little bit, but she treats children as born persons. And so this idea that children are capable of, eating the whole meal is part of the idea of how we treat children's literature. And so children understand that there is hardship and that there is difficulty in this world. And I sort of struggle with this when I read any number of books with my children, that's like Aesop's Fables. I would say 80% pretty violent, pretty scary.
Absolutely.
And so one of the first questions that I had when I had my oldest was 3 or 4 years old was, do I really want to be reading this with her? This is scary and this is violent. And what I noticed, and what I sort of talked to other homeschool moms and what they told me, and I've absolutely sort of found this to be true, is they're not scared when they're on your lap. And all of these things, they will eventually become exposed to these ideas, to life and death and all these things. And what better place for them to learn about the difficulties and the injustices of this world than on their mom's lap? And that's the safest sort of entry into the hardness of life. And so, especially with the Thomas Sowell book and going through all of our books, the Ronald Reagan book is also, there's the introduction of the alcoholism of his father in that book, and that's a difficult topic, but that's unfortunately a topic that a lot of children are going to be familiar with in their lives or become familiar with, the idea of alcohol addiction and dependency. And it's treated very gently, very carefully. We're not going for shock value, but this was part of Ronald Reagan's life story, and it helped shape who he was as a person. And what better way for kids to be exposed to it than very gently, very, very subtly, but on their mom's or dad's lap.
It's really interesting. You hear about, critical race theory not being taught in schools, right? And I always, whenever I hear that, I think, well, okay, perhaps that's true for young children. You're not going to teach the theory to young children, but it's the praxis. It's kind of the whole kind of ideology being kind of infused into the educational materials, right?
Yeah.
That's the question. So I guess my question is, why do you see this as a problem? Or what is the problem? What does it bring in to children that you don't want to see?
So for children, I think the biggest issue with CRT, in my personal opinion, is that for white children, it teaches them that they should feel sorry for being white when that's just who you are, and that's okay. It's okay to be white. And for black children, I think it's actually more damaging because it's teaching them that they are inherently victims and that they have been victimized by everyone around you and by everything around you. And so it's a pretty toxic way to raise a child, to either peg them as a victim or victimizer. And all of those things come with emotional baggage, and there's no need for that, because a white 4-year-old boy is not a victimizer, and a black 4-year-old girl is not a victim. They are equal humans, and that was something that we really wanted to drive home, especially in the Ronald Reagan book, the Thomas Sowell book, that he had difficulty, absolutely, but he still, pulled himself up by his bootstraps and didn't take any favors, and he didn't want any shortcuts, and he was better for it. And that's a lesson that I think every child needs to hear, that the shortcuts in life are not going to, it's the road that is the journey. The journey is as important as the destination. And that's an important lesson for any child to hear.
And so, you kind of indict the publishing industry for, prioritizing wokeness within the literature, within the writing and the picture books. And so how does this actually manifest? Like, you've seen things that you were like, okay, no, this isn't going to be something my kids are going to be reading.
Yeah.
Like, what are the sorts of things that you're seeing? Yeah.
It's so funny. I was at my husband's office right before I came here, and I was going to grab it, and I forgot. There's a new picture book out, The ABCs of AOC. So A is for activist, B is for Bronx, and there's all of that very overt indoctrination, but I think what's more damaging is the very subtle indoctrination. And so I've spoken to a number of authors and different people who are much more intimately familiar with the children's book industry, the mainstream of it and how it stands. And what they've told me, the most insidious thing that they do is slip in gender ideology within a book that's completely separate. So a counting book or things like that. There's a girl who thinks she's a boy in a book about counting, for example. And from the teacher's side of it, which I've heard from literacy experts who work in schools, is they're not teaching it explicitly, like a boy can be a girl, and that's not what they're doing. They're using these sort of gender ideology books in lessons that are totally separate. So, if you're learning a sentence structure, you could use a book called I Am Jazz, which is about a young boy who decided he was a girl, and it's the subject of a TLC show. It's a very famous transgender child. And so that book, I Am Jazz, isn't used as an indoctrination tool at the read aloud, which, by the way, then would have to be put on the curriculum list that the teacher is supplying to parents. But instead, a teacher would use that to teach about sentence structure. And so that does two things. It normalizes it, and it also makes it so that parents might not necessarily see, like, this is the list of read aloud books that we're reading aloud in our classroom this year.
Well, yeah, and it makes me think of this other theme, that there seems to be this sort of activism around teachers. You say that the teachers are the one
Yes.
who are kind of driving this whole, through their purchasing power. There seems to be this sort of idea that the teachers have the right, or even perhaps the duty, to function outside of the realm of the parents' knowledge, because otherwise how can we get our plan across or ideas across, right?
You pretty much verbatim told me what I heard from a teacher last night. I have been, this is a topic that animates me sort of in my professional life as an opinion writer as well. And I spoke to a teacher literally last night who said that same thing. They see it as their job because these knuckle dragging, bigoted parents are not going to introduce these topics to their children. So it's our job, it's our responsibility to make sure that they're being exposed to these topics so that when they grow up, they're not bigots like their parents.
Presumably the Virginia gubernatorial election, or the Virginia elections with, Governor Youngkin being elected, sort of speaks to what parents think about that.
I think it does, but I'm not sure how much of the governor election was about CRT and how much it was just, they kept the schools closed for 1.5 years in Northern Virginia, and people were really mad. Youngkin did not have Randy Weingarten give his closing statements, so that can be pretty damaging. But I think it's all intertwined, but it's hard to sort of pin down what percentage is CRT. And I think that the school closures added to a lot of this also. And I think that you can't really separate it, because a lot of parents over the course of the school closures saw firsthand what their kids were learning, and they were alarmed by it, and they should have been alarmed by it. So I'm not sure how much I would put it on CRT versus, I think just parents have lost faith in the education system as it stands, rightfully so.
There seems to be, or many people I've spoken with, let's put it this way, a number of people I've spoken with tell me that one of the things about, in these woke books, as you describe them, is that they're explicitly not patriotic or even anti-patriotic.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
So explain this to me.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of part and parcel of the whole sort of woke and progressive ideology, not necessarily as it pertains to kids, but, America is a flawed nation. So one of the things we want to do in the future with Heroes of Liberty is do a Founding Fathers series, because a lot of books that tackle the Founding Fathers will talk about their slave owning and will sort of degrade our Founding Fathers. And that's not to say that they were not imperfect people. They were absolutely imperfect people. But there's so many dimensions to issues like slavery and the fact that many of our Founding Fathers did own slaves. But the impression that you get when you read mainstream children's literature written about people like George Washington, there's such a heavy emphasis on his slave owning that it really detracts from the larger picture of who he was and who he accomplished. And I think that it's important for children to know about those things. We're not whitewashing this not great part of our history, but at the same time, we don't want them to hate America. We don't want them to hate themselves. And that seems to be the goal of a lot of these books about American history in the mainstream is, to view America as a flawed nation built on crumbling rock, basically.
You said something interesting. They hate themselves along. So how so?
Yeah, I mean, we're Americans. And so if you raise children that white people are victimizers and men especially there's that whole other aspect of, the anti-masculinity stuff. And then Americans are inherently racist because this is a country built on the foundation of racism. I mean, that's basically the entire objective of the 1619 Project, is to tell children, because now this is a curriculum that's in the schools, the 1619 Project wants children to believe and know that this country was built on a foundation of slavery and racism. And when we teach all of that, that has a lot of long-standing implications for children on an individual basis, but then also as a society. Do you want to live in a country where everyone hates the country? And that's that self-hatingness when it comes to America. So I think that what their objective is they want to be able to tear themselves down. It's very Marxist. They want to tear children down to build them into the way that they want them to be. And so the first step in building a child into what they want is to tear down everything that came before. That's the
Marxist project.
Yeah.
Right.